It was a quiet little town in West Virginia, Hollow Ridge. Population just shy of 1,000. Blink while driving through and you'd miss it. It wasn't the kind of place people thought about much, unless they lived there. And most of us who lived there never left, at least not alive. I grew up in Hollow Ridge, surrounded by dense woods and misty hollows. Everyone always said the town had history, centuries of it, but no one ever said what kind. There were stories, though. Kids whispered about the Watcher of the Hollow, an old tale meant to scare us into behaving. It was said that if you wandered too far into the woods, the Watcher would find you. He'd take you to his hollow, and you'd never come back. Just an old legend, right? Until last year, I thought so too. It started on a cold October night. I had just moved back into town after college. My mom had passed away, and I was sorting through her house, trying to decide what to do with it. The place was falling apart, but it was home, or it had been. That night, I was going through old boxes in the attic. The wind outside howled like a wild animal, and the whole house creaked. I found a box labeled Anna's Things. Anna was my sister. She disappeared when I was 10, and she was 13. The police said she'd likely run away, but that never made sense. Anna loved Hollow Ridge, even if I didn't, and she loved me. Inside the box were her drawings, school papers, and a diary. I flipped through it, feeling like an intruder, but then I found the last entry. The words chilled me to my core. The Watcher is real. I saw him today in the woods. He's been watching me for weeks. He whispers my name at night. If you're reading this, it means he finally took me. I slammed the diary shut and tossed it back in the box. It was just a story, I told myself, a kid's imagination. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Her words played over and over in my mind. He finally took me. The next day, I needed air, so I went for a walk in the woods behind the house. The trees loomed tall and close, their branches gnarled like claws. The farther I walked, the quieter it became, until all I could hear was the crunch of leaves underfoot. Then I heard it. My name. Eli. It was faint, like a whisper carried on the wind. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Eli. This time it was louder, more distinct. It sounded like Anna. I spun around, searching for the source, but there was no one there. Just endless trees. I ran back to the house, slamming the door behind me. I told myself it was the wind or my imagination, but deep down I knew better. Something was out there. Over the next few days, the whispers didn't stop. They got closer, clearer. It wasn't just Anna's voice anymore. Sometimes it was my mom's. Sometimes it was voices I didn't recognize, always calling my name, always just out of sight. I started sleeping with the lights on, though sleep rarely came. One night, as I lay staring at the ceiling, I heard the floorboards creak downstairs. My heart leapt into my throat. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the bed and crept down the stairs. The house was pitch black, but I could feel it. Someone was there. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. No answer. But then, a figure moved in the shadows. I swung the bat, but it passed through nothing. The figure dissolved like smoke, and I stumbled backward. When I looked again, it was gone. That's when I knew I couldn't stay in the house. I packed a bag and drove to the only motel in town. The room was shabby and smelled like mildew, but it felt safer than home, or at least it did until that night. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, like a mouse in the walls, but it grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the window. I sat up, my heart pounding, and saw a silhouette on the other side of the glass. It wasn't human. Its face was long and pale, with hollow, empty eyes that seemed to glow faintly. Its hands were pressed against the glass, long fingers tipped with claws that dragged down, making that awful scratching sound. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then it spoke. "Eli, come home." Its voice was a guttural rasp, like something trying to mimic speech but not quite getting it right. I screamed, stumbling out of bed and grabbing my keys. I didn't even bother packing. I just ran to my car and drove. I don't know how long I drove. Hours, maybe. By the time I stopped, the sun was rising and I was in the next town over. I sat in a diner, sipping coffee with shaking hands, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was I losing my mind? Was the Watcher real? I called my friend Rachel, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, but who had always been good at grounding me. When I told her what was happening, she didn't laugh or call me crazy. Instead, she said, "There's something you need to know." She told me about her grandmother, who grew up in Hollow Ridge. Her grandmother used to tell her stories about the Watcher, about how he wasn't just a legend. He was a spirit or a demon or something worse. He preyed on the lonely, the grieving, the ones who wandered too far into his woods. And once he marked you, he didn't stop until he had you. Do not go back to that house, Rachel said. Promise me. I promised. But I lied. I had to go back. Not for me, but for Anna. If the Watcher was real, if he had taken her, then I had to know. I had to try to stop him. When I got back to Hollow Ridge, it was dusk. The house loomed dark and empty, but I didn't go inside. Instead, I went straight into the woods. I wandered for what felt like hours, calling Anna's name. The trees closed in around me, and the air grew colder. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They weren't mine. I turned and saw him, the Watcher. He stood at the edge of a clearing, tall and skeletal, his pale face leering at me. His eyes were black voids, endless and consuming. Eli, he whispered, his voice echoing in my mind. Welcome home. I ran. Branches tore at my skin, roots tripped me, but I didn't stop. His laughter followed me, deep and guttural, like the sound of the earth itself laughing. When I burst out of the woods and into the town, the laughter stopped. That was 2 months ago. I left Hollow Ridge that night and haven't gone back. But the thing is, I don't think I escaped him. Sometimes when I'm alone, I still hear my name whispered in the dark.
Story number 2.
Here's another terrifying tale. I used to think the world made sense. Bad things happened, sure, but they could always be explained. At least, that's what I believed before the summer of 2015. That was the year my husband, Ben, and I moved to the little town of Black Hollow, Kentucky. The town was idyllic at first glance. Rolling hills, thick forests, and a main street straight out of a Norman Rockwell painting. We were city folk, but we'd bought a fixer-upper on the edge of town, eager for a fresh start. The house was old, built in the 1800s with creaky floors and drafty windows. But the price was too good to pass up. The realtor had mumbled something about a history when we asked why it was so cheap, but we didn't care. We were ready to make it ours. I wish we hadn't. It started small, just noises at first. Footsteps in the attic when we were downstairs, doors creaking open on their own. Ben chalked it up to the house settling, but I wasn't so sure. One night, about a week after we moved in, I was alone in the kitchen unpacking boxes. It was late, and the house was eerily silent. I was bent over, rummaging through a box when I felt it, a cold breath on the back of my neck. I froze. Slowly, I turned, expecting to see Ben, but there was no one there, just the empty kitchen and the dark hallway beyond. I told Ben about it when he got home, but he laughed it off. "You're spooking yourself," he said. "This house is old. It's probably just drafts." But it wasn't just drafts. The next night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of whispering. It was faint, almost like static, but definitely voices. I nudged Ben awake, but by the time he stirred, the whispering had stopped. "You're imagining things," he mumbled before rolling over and falling back asleep. But I wasn't imagining it. The next morning, I found scratches on the basement door. They were deep and jagged, like claw marks, and they hadn't been there the day before. Ben thought it was an animal that had gotten into the house, but when he searched the basement, it was empty. That's when I started researching the house. The local library didn't have much, but I found an old article online about the original owner, a man named Elias Harper. He was a preacher who'd moved to Black Hollow in the late 1800s. According to the article, Elias had gone mad and murdered his entire congregation before hanging himself in the basement of the house. I felt sick. I told Ben what I'd found, but he didn't want to hear it. "That was over 100 years ago," he said. "It's just a story." But it wasn't just a story. That night, I woke up to the sound of the basement door creaking open. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. Ben was still asleep beside me. I grabbed my phone and crept down the stairs. The house was dark, but I could see the basement door standing ajar. Slowly, I approached it, every nerve in my body screaming for me to stop. When I reached the door, I peered down into the basement. It was pitch black, but I could feel something down there. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice trembling. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl. I slammed the door shut and ran back upstairs. I woke Ben and begged him to leave the house, but he refused. "You're overreacting," he said. The next day, Ben went to work and I stayed home, too scared to be alone. I kept every light in the house on and avoided the basement like the plague. Around noon, I heard the front door open. "Ben?" I called out, relieved he was home early. But there was no answer. I walked to the door, my heart pounding. It was wide open, but no one was there. That's when I saw them. Footprints, wet and muddy, leading from the door to the basement. I grabbed my keys and ran. I drove to the local diner and called Ben, telling him what had happened. He agreed to meet me there after work. That evening, we returned to the house together. Ben was skeptical, but I could see the unease in his eyes. When we stepped inside, the air was heavy, oppressive. The house was eerily silent, except for a faint dripping sound coming from the basement. "I'll check it out," Ben said, grabbing a flashlight. I waited at the top of the stairs, every second feeling like an eternity. Then Ben screamed. I ran down the stairs, my heart in my throat. When I reached the bottom, I found Ben standing in the middle of the basement, his flashlight trembling in his hand. On the far wall, written in what looked like blood, were the words, "Get out." We didn't stay another night. We packed what we could and left town, abandoning the house and everything we dreamed it could be. Sometimes, I wonder if we were just imagining things, if the stress of the move and the history of the house got to us. But then I think about the whispers, the growls, and the bloody message on the wall. And I know the truth, some places are evil. And Black Hollow is one of them.
Story number 3.
They say you can never go home again. For me, that phrase carries a weight I wish I could forget. Growing up, I always felt like something was off about my small hometown, Willow Creek, Ohio. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, but secrets ran deep and dark. The one thing everyone agreed on was to never talk about the Ashton House. It sat at the edge of town, a massive Victorian structure with boarded-up windows and a sagging roof. Some said it was haunted. Others said it was cursed. What everyone knew was that people who went inside didn't come out the same, or didn't come out at all. I was 12 the first time I heard the name. My friend Joey dared me to run up and touch the front door. I refused, of course, but he didn't. He went up the overgrown driveway, grinning back at me the whole time. Then, just as his hand touched the peeling paint of the door, it opened. It didn't swing open like in the movies. It cracked open, just enough for us to see the darkness beyond. Joey froze. I remember calling out to him, but he didn't answer. Then, without a word, he stepped inside. I ran home, too scared to even try to stop him. When Joey didn't show up at school the next day or the next week, the adults said his family had moved away suddenly. But that wasn't true. His house was still there, his parents still living in it. But Joey, he was gone. For years. I convinced myself it was a coincidence. Kids move, families leave, it happens. But part of me always wondered. That brings me to last summer when I returned to Willow Creek for my father's funeral. I hadn't been back in years, but the town was exactly as I'd left it. Quiet, uneasy. The Ashton House still stood at the edge of town, as ominous as ever. I couldn't help but stare at it every time I passed, the memories of Joey gnawing at me. By the third day, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. It was just after sunset when I drove to the house. The air was heavy, humid, and the cicadas buzzed like an electric hum. I parked at the end of the driveway and stared at the house. My heart was racing as I walked up to the front door. The weeds and thorns tugged at my jeans as if trying to pull me back. When I reached the door, I hesitated. Then, just like all those years ago, the door cracked open. I froze. Every instinct told me to turn and run, but something stronger pulled me forward. I stepped inside. The air inside was stale, suffocating. The house was silent, but I felt like I was being watched. The faint scent of rot lingered in the air. The hallway stretched before me, dimly lit by what little moonlight seeped through the cracks in the boards. "Joey?" I whispered, though I didn't expect an answer. But I got one. A low, wet sound, like someone trying to speak with a mouthful of water, echoed from upstairs. My stomach turned, but I forced myself to move forward. The stairs groaned under my weight as I climbed. At the top, the hallway was lined with doors, all slightly ajar. The sound came again, louder this time, from the last door on the right. I pushed it open. The room was empty, except for a mirror standing in the center. It was old, its silver frame tarnished and ornate. The glass shimmered faintly as if it were alive. As I stepped closer, I saw my reflection. But it wasn't right. My face was pale, my eyes hollow, and behind me in the reflection stood Joey. Joey! I spun around, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, he was still there, his face twisted in anguish. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Then the glass rippled and a hand reached through. It was skeletal, its skin stretched thin and blackened, its fingers tipped with claws. I stumbled back, but the hand grabbed my arm, its grip cold and unyielding. I screamed, pulling away, but it held on. The mirror shimmered, and I felt myself being pulled toward it. Joey's reflection mouthed a single word. "Run." With a surge of adrenaline, I wrenched free, falling to the floor. The mirror shattered with a deafening crash, shards flying in all directions. When I looked up, the room was empty again. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran, stumbling down the stairs and out the door. The house seemed alive as I fled, the walls groaning and the floor buckling beneath me. When I finally burst outside, I didn't stop until I reached my car. I didn't look back. That was 3 months ago. I haven't told anyone what happened that night, but I still see Joey in my dreams. His face, his eyes, pleading. And sometimes when I look in the mirror, I catch a glimpse of that room behind me.
Story number 4.
They called it Widow's Hollow, a small patch of dense forest just outside of town, shrouded in mist and legend. Every kid growing up in Pine Creek knew the stories, the kind you'd hear around a campfire or whispered during sleepovers. They said the hollow was cursed, that anyone who entered after dark would never come back the same. My friends and I used to laugh about it. It was just another dumb story to keep kids from wandering off. Or so we thought. Last year, I found out how wrong we were. It was the summer before senior year, and my friend Kyle dared us to go camping in Widow's Hollow. One night, he said, grinning like an idiot. Prove we're not scared. There were 5 of us. Me, Kyle, Sarah, Mike, and Jenna. We loaded up our gear and hiked out to the hollow just before sunset. The air was thick with humidity, and the woods were unnervingly quiet. No birds, no insects, just the crunch of our boots on the dry leaves. We set up camp in a clearing near the heart of the hollow. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest was cloaked in an unnatural darkness. We lit a fire, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the surrounding trees. Kyle, ever the showman, started telling the legend of Widow's Hollow. She was a witch, he began, his voice low and theatrical. Back in the 1800s, she lived out here alone after her husband died. The townsfolk said she was cursed, that she'd made a pact with the devil to bring him back. When the children started disappearing, they blamed her. They dragged her out here and burned her alive. But before she died, she swore she'd get her revenge. They say her spirit still roams these woods, looking for anyone foolish enough to trespass. Classic Kyle, Sarah muttered, rolling her eyes. Yeah, real original, Jenna added. Kyle laughed, but there was an edge to it. You don't have to believe me, he said. But people have gone missing out here. Like who? Mike challenged. Kyle shrugged. Ever heard of Dylan Carter? I hadn't thought about Dylan in years. He was a senior when I was a freshman, and he'd vanished one night after a party. Everyone assumed he'd run away, but his car was found abandoned on the edge of Widow's Hollow. That's just a coincidence, I said, though my voice wavered. Sure it is, Kyle replied, smirking. As the night wore on, the fire began to die down, and an uneasy silence settled over us. The darkness felt oppressive, pressing in from all sides. Then we heard it, a faint sound, like someone crying. We all froze, exchanging nervous glances. Probably just an animal, Mike said, though he didn't sound convinced. The crying grew louder, closer. It was a woman's voice, raw and full of anguish. Hello? Kyle called out, standing. Kyle, don't, Sarah hissed, grabbing his arm. But Kyle pulled away, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. If someone's out there, they might need help, he said. Reluctantly, we followed him, our own flashlights casting shaky beams of light. The crying led us deeper into the hollow, the trees closing in like prison bars. Finally, we came to a small clearing. In the center stood a figure, a woman in a tattered black dress, her long, matted hair obscuring her face. She was hunched over, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Ma'am, Kyle said cautiously, stepping closer. The woman stopped crying. Slowly, she turned toward us, her movements unnaturally jerky like a marionette on frayed strings. Her face was wrong. Her eyes were sunken pits of darkness, and her mouth stretched too wide in a grotesque grin. Leave, she whispered, her voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. We didn't need to be told twice. We turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush like terrified animals. The air grew colder with every step, and the shadows seemed to move, twisting and reaching for us. When we finally stumbled back to our campsite, the fire was out. Our tents were shredded, our gear scattered. Where's Kyle? Jenna gasped, her voice trembling. We all turned, realizing for the first time that he wasn't with us. Kyle, I shouted, but the only response was the distant sound of the woman's laughter, cold and hollow. We searched for him until dawn, but he was gone. The police didn't believe us, of course. They said Kyle must have gotten lost or decided to run off, just like Dylan Carter. But we knew the truth. I still dream about that night. About the woman in black, her empty eyes and too wide grin. Sometimes I wake up to the sound of crying outside my window, and every time I wonder if it's Kyle or if it's her.
Story number 5.
I never believed in ghosts, not until I met one. It started a few months after I moved into my apartment in an old building downtown. The place had charm, exposed brick, creaky hardwood floors, and a view of the park. It was perfect, at least I thought so at first. The first strange thing happened about 2 weeks in. I came home from work to find all the lights on. I was sure I'd turned them off before leaving, but I brushed it off. Maybe I'd been distracted. Then it got weirder. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate. I lived alone. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone and crept to the door. The footsteps stopped just outside. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. I swung the door open, ready to confront whatever or whoever was there. The hallway was empty. For weeks, these incidents continued. Lights turning on and off by themselves, objects moving when I wasn't looking, the sound of soft whispers late at night. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. One night, I decided to stay up and catch whatever was happening. I set up my phone to record the living room and sat on the couch with a cup of coffee, my nerves shot. At around 2 a.m., the temperature dropped. I could see my breath in the air, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Then, I saw her. She appeared in the corner of the room, translucent but unmistakable. A young woman, her hair damp and tangled, her clothes tattered and wet. She stared at me with eyes that were hollow, dark pits. I couldn't move. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I blinked, and she was gone. The next morning, I checked the recording. My hands shook as I played it back, half hoping I'd imagined the whole thing. But there she was, clear as day. I showed the video to my landlord, hoping for answers. He turned pale when he saw it. "Her name was Emily," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She lived here 5 years ago. She drowned in the river after her fiancé called off their wedding. People say her spirit never left. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't afford to break my lease. So I stayed, hoping she'd move on. She didn't. Her appearances became more frequent. Sometimes I'd wake up to find her standing at the foot of my bed, her expression one of sorrow and longing. Other times, I'd hear her crying from the bathroom. One night, she spoke to me again. "He didn't love me," she said, her voice filled with pain. So I stayed. I stayed where he couldn't leave me. I didn't know what to say. I tried to research her story, hoping to find a way to help her. I learned that her fiancé had left town shortly after her death. No one knew where he went, and no one had ever been able to lay her to rest. Desperate, I visited the river where she had died. I brought flowers and said a prayer, begging her to find peace. For a while, it seemed to work. The apartment was quiet, and I started to feel safe again. Until last week. I woke up to find a message scrawled on the bathroom mirror in dripping water. "Why did you leave me?" Her reflection appeared behind me, her eyes burning with anger. I don't think she wants peace anymore.
Story number 6.
They called it the Lantern Man. In our small town of Ashford, deep in the Appalachian foothills, the legend of the Lantern Man had been passed down for generations. My grandmother used to warn me, "If you see a lantern swinging in the woods at night, don't follow it. No matter what you hear, no matter who calls your name, don't follow it." I never believed her. Not until the night I saw it for myself. It was late October, the night before Halloween. My friends and I had been drinking around a bonfire near the edge of the woods, swapping ghost stories and daring each other to do stupid things. When someone brought up the Lantern Man, the mood shifted. "You know he's not real, right?" my friend Caleb said, rolling his eyes. "It's just a story to keep kids from wandering off." "Prove it," I said, half drunk and feeling brave. That was all it took. Caleb grabbed a flashlight, and we headed into the woods, the others trailing behind us. The night was cold, and the forest was eerily quiet. No wind, no crickets, just the crunch of leaves beneath our boots. About 10 minutes in, we saw it. A faint, golden light, swinging back and forth in the distance. It moved like someone was carrying a lantern, just out of reach. "See?" Caleb whispered, though his voice trembled. "It's probably just some old guy hunting or something." "Then why isn't there a beam from the flashlight?" Jenna asked, clutching my arm. She was right. The light didn't flicker or cast shadows. It just glowed, steady and unnatural. Then we heard it. My name, faint and drawn out, floating on the still air. "Sarah, Sarah, Sarah." I froze. That's your mom's voice," Jenna stammered, her grip tightening. "It can't be," I whispered. My mom was at home, miles away, but the voice came again, clearer this time. "Sarah, help me." Against every ounce of logic, I took a step toward the light. "Don't. Caleb hissed, grabbing my arm. You know the stories. But the voice sounded so real, so desperate. I pulled away and started walking, the light growing brighter as I got closer. Sarah! Caleb shouted, his voice laced with panic. I ignored him. The light was mesmerizing, drawing me in like a moth to a flame. The forest seemed to shift around me, the trees closing in as the light grew brighter and the voice more insistent. Sarah, please. Finally, I reached a small clearing. The lantern was there, floating in the air, its golden glow illuminating the gnarled trees around it, but no one was holding it. Mom? I called out, my voice trembling. The light blinked out. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness and silence. Then I felt it, a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, and there he was, the lantern man. He was tall, impossibly thin, his skin stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were hollow, glowing with the same golden light as the lantern. His mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too white. Before I could scream, he leaned in, his voice a low, rasping whisper. You shouldn't have come. I stumbled back, my legs giving out beneath me. The forest seemed to come alive, shadows twisting and reaching for me. Sarah! Caleb's voice cut through the chaos. I turned to see him and Jenna standing at the edge of the clearing, their flashlights piercing the darkness. Run! I screamed, scrambling to my feet. The lantern man reached for me, his fingers impossibly long and skeletal. I bolted, crashing through the underbrush as the forest seemed to close in behind me. When we finally burst out of the woods and back into the clearing with the bonfire, the others were waiting, their faces pale and terrified. What happened? Someone asked, but I couldn't speak. I never went back to those woods, and neither did Caleb or Jenna. But sometimes, late at night, I see a faint golden light flickering through my bedroom window, and I hear my name whispered on the wind. And I know he's still out there, waiting.
Story number 7.
The house on Elmwood Street was never supposed to be mine. I inherited it after my uncle passed away last summer. I hadn't even known he owned a house. He was the black sheep of the family, the kind of relative you only heard about when something went wrong. The house was old, Victorian, and loomed like a shadow at the end of a dead-end street. It was the kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie, like with ivy creeping up the walls and windows that seemed to stare like empty eyes. I didn't want to move in, but the will was clear. If I stayed in the house for 1 year, I'd inherit it along with a considerable sum of money. I was in no position to say no. The first night was uneventful, though the house creaked and groaned like it was alive. The air was heavy, stale, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something else, something metallic. I chalked it up to nerves, but by the second night I knew something was wrong. It started with the clock in the hallway. It was an antique, its brass pendulum swinging back and forth with a steady tick-tock. I was in the kitchen when I heard it stop. Curious, I went to check. The pendulum had frozen mid-swing, but the hands were spinning wildly, faster and faster, as if time itself had unraveled. Then it stopped abruptly, the hands pointing to midnight. The house fell silent. Hello? I called out, my voice echoing. A soft whisper answered, so faint I almost missed it. Get out. I turned, my heart pounding, but the hallway was empty. For the next week, the house grew increasingly hostile. Lights flickered and bulbs shattered. Doors opened and closed on their own. At night, I heard footsteps pacing above me, even though the attic was locked. One night, I finally worked up the courage to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, I forced the attic door open. The air inside was freezing and the smell was overwhelming, rot and decay. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing old furniture draped in sheets and boxes piled high with dust. Then I saw it. In the far corner, a figure stood, its back to me. It was unnaturally tall, its frame gaunt and twisted. It didn't move, didn't breathe. Who's there? I demanded, though my voice shook. The figure turned slowly. Its face was a nightmare, sunken eyes that burned with an otherworldly light, a mouth that stretched too wide in a grin that wasn't human. It didn't speak, it just stared, its head tilting as if studying me. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a box. My flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, it lunged. I screamed and ran, slamming the attic door behind me. The next morning, I found scratches on the inside of the door, long and deep, as if something had been clawing to get out. I tried to leave, but every time I packed my bags, something stopped me. The air would grow heavy, the walls seeming to close in. One night, my car wouldn't start, and when I checked the engine, I found it filled with black sludge. The house didn't want me to leave. The final straw came 2 weeks ago. I woke up to find myself in the attic, lying on the cold floor. I didn't remember going there, but the figure was waiting, its grin wider than ever. "You're mine," it whispered, its voice like dry leaves scraping against stone. I don't remember how I escaped, but I know I can't stay here much longer. The house wants me, and I think soon I won't be able to fight it anymore.
Story number 8.
It was supposed to be a weekend getaway. My girlfriend Emily and I had found a quaint little cabin online, nestled deep in the woods of the Pacific Northwest. It looked perfect, isolated, cozy, and just far enough from civilization to feel like an adventure. We arrived late Friday evening, the sun setting behind the dense trees. The cabin was exactly as advertised, rustic but charming, with a stone fireplace and large windows overlooking the forest. The first night was uneventful. We cooked dinner, played board games, and sat by the fire laughing about how much we needed this break. But the next morning, things started to feel off. It began with the woods. The air outside was heavy, still, and the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence. While hiking a nearby trail, Emily stopped suddenly. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing ahead. At first, I didn't see anything, but then I noticed it. A figure standing deep in the trees, barely visible through the shadows. It was a woman. She wore a long, tattered dress, and her hair hung in damp, stringy clumps. She wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at us. "Hello?" I called out, but she didn't respond. When I took a step closer, Emily grabbed my arm. "Don't," she hissed. We turned and hurried back to the cabin, the feeling of being watched following us all the way. That night, the atmosphere in the cabin changed. The air grew cold, and the fire in the hearth flickered erratically, as if caught in a sudden breeze. At around midnight, we heard it, a faint tapping on the window. Emily and I froze, exchanging wide-eyed glances. Slowly, I approached the window, my breath fogging up the glass. Nothing was there. As I turned away, the tapping started again, louder this time. "Check the door," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. I crept to the front door and looked through the peephole. The porch was empty, but as I stepped back, the door handle jiggled violently as if someone was trying to force their way inside. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The jiggling stopped, replaced by a soft, hollow laugh that sent chills down my spine. We didn't sleep that night, jumping at every creak and shadow. By morning, we decided to cut the trip short. As we packed, I noticed something strange. The woods outside the cabin seemed closer. The trees that had been several yards away now loomed just outside the windows, their gnarled branches brushing against the glass. "Hurry up," I urged Emily, my voice tight with panic. We loaded the car and drove down the narrow dirt road, the forest pressing in on all sides. About a mile out, we saw her again, the woman in the tattered dress, standing in the middle of the road. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and black. I slammed on the brakes, but before the car came to a full stop, she vanished. We didn't speak the rest of the drive. When we got home, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe we were overtired or our minds had played tricks on us. But then Emily showed me her phone. She'd taken a photo of the cabin before we left. In the reflection of the window, you could see the woman. She was inside, standing behind us.